Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to break down one of the most dramatic and unprecedented moments in modern Russian military history. A moment that many experts once believed was impossible. The idea that Russian generals would openly challenge the command structure, hesitate to follow orders, or quietly resist the Kremlin has long been dismissed as Western fantasy. Yet recent developments suggest that something fundamental inside Russia's military system has fractured, and the consequences of that fracture are rippling far beyond the battlefield. For decades, Vladimir Putin has ruled through a carefully balanced system of loyalty, fear, and centralized control. The Russian military was designed not just as a fighting force, but as a political instrument, one that answered directly to the Kremlin and ultimately to Putin himself. Promotions were often based as much on loyalty as competence, and dissent was ruthlessly punished. This system worked as long as victories could be claimed and losses could be hidden, but prolonged conflict has a way of exposing weaknesses that propaganda cannot fully erase. As the war dragged on, pressure on Russian commanders steadily increased. Generals were expected to deliver results with limited resources, outdated equipment, and constantly shifting political directives. Orders from the top often ignored realities on the ground, demanding advances without adequate support or forcing units to hold indefensible positions simply to satisfy political narratives. Over time, this created a dangerous gap between what the Kremlin wanted to hear and what commanders were actually facing. Reports began to surface of delayed orders, selective interpretations of commands, and unusual hesitation at key moments. At first, these incidents were brushed off as logistical failures or miscommunication, but patterns started to emerge. Multiple units across different regions showed similar behavior, suggesting coordination or at least a shared understanding among senior officers that blind obedience was no longer sustainable. This was not loud rebellion, but something more subtle and potentially more dangerous for the Kremlin: passive defiance. Russian generals found themselves trapped between impossible expectations and the survival of their own forces. Continuing to follow unrealistic orders meant catastrophic losses and personal accountability when things inevitably failed. Disobeying orders, even quietly, carried the risk of political punishment, imprisonment, or worse. This tension created a silent crisis inside the command structure, one that could no longer be hidden once operational failures became too large to ignore. The historical significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian military has been rebuilt around the idea of strong, centralized authority. Independent thinking was discouraged, and initiative was tightly controlled. Generals were not meant to question strategy, only to execute it. The emergence of open or semi-open defiance signals a breakdown of this model, suggesting that fear alone is no longer enough to enforce compliance. One of the key factors driving this shift is exhaustion. Years of continuous operations, repeated rotations without adequate rest, and constant pressure from Moscow have taken a heavy toll on both officers and enlisted soldiers. Morale has suffered, and trust in leadership has eroded. When soldiers see their commanders struggling to justify orders that lead to heavy casualties, the chain of command begins to weaken from the inside. Another factor is credibility. Putin's leadership has been built on an image of strength and control, but repeated military setbacks have damaged that image within the armed forces themselves. Generals who once believed that the Kremlin had a clear plan now see conflicting directives and reactive decision-making. When confidence in the top leadership fades, obedience becomes conditional rather than automatic. Economic strain has also played a role. Sanctions, budget constraints, and supply shortages have forced commanders to make difficult choices. Promises made by the central government regarding equipment and reinforcements often failed to materialize. Generals on the ground were left to manage expectations with fewer tools, increasing frustration and resentment toward decision makers far removed from the battlefield. The response from the Kremlin has been a mix of denial, intimidation, and scapegoating. Some commanders have been quietly removed, reassigned, or publicly blamed for failures that stemmed from systemic issues. This approach may suppress dissent temporarily, but it also reinforces the perception that loyalty is valued over honesty. As a result, remaining generals become even more cautious about fully committing to risky operations that could end their careers. Historically, moments like this often mark turning points. When military leaders begin to prioritize institutional survival over political obedience, the balance of power starts to shift. This does not necessarily mean an immediate collapse or coup, but it does indicate that centralized control is weakening. In authoritarian systems, the military is often the final pillar of stability, and cracks in that pillar can have far-reaching consequences. International observers are watching closely. A Russian military that is internally divided and hesitant is less predictable, which increases risks not only for Russia, but for the wider region. Miscalculations become more likely when commanders are unsure whose directives to follow or how far they can deviate from official orders. This uncertainty adds another layer of instability to an already volatile situation. It is important to understand that defiance does not always look dramatic. There are no grand speeches or televised confrontations. Instead, it appears as delayed offensives, cautious maneuvers, and a noticeable lack of enthusiasm in executing aggressive strategies. These subtle actions can be just as impactful as open rebellion, slowly undermining the effectiveness of the entire military apparatus. Putin's loss of control, if it continues, could force difficult decisions. He may attempt to tighten his grip by increasing surveillance, rotating commanders more frequently, or placing loyalists in key positions regardless of experience. While this might restore short-term obedience, it risks further degrading operational effectiveness. Loyalty without competence is a dangerous foundation for any military. On the other hand, allowing more autonomy could improve battlefield performance, but would require a level of trust that the current political system struggles to offer. Empowered generals might make better tactical decisions, but they could also push back against strategic goals set by the Kremlin. This dilemma highlights the core contradiction facing Putin's leadership at this stage. The situation also raises questions about the future of civil-military relations in Russia. If generals continue to assert quiet independence, the traditional hierarchy may never fully recover. Younger officers observing these events may adopt a more pragmatic approach to authority, valuing outcomes over obedience. Over time, this could reshape the culture of the armed forces in ways that are difficult to reverse. From a historical perspective, many regimes have faced similar moments where prolonged conflict exposed internal weaknesses. Some managed to adapt and survive, while others spiraled into deeper crises. The outcome often depended on whether leadership could acknowledge reality and reform, or whether it doubled down on control and punishment. So far, signs suggest that the Kremlin is leaning toward the latter. For Putin personally, this represents one of the greatest challenges of his rule. His authority has always relied on projecting strength and decisiveness. A military that no longer responds with unquestioning loyalty undermines that image at its core. Even if the public remains largely insulated from the full truth, the perception inside the elite and security apparatus matters immensely. As this situation evolves, the key question is whether this defiance remains contained or spreads further. If more generals quietly align around shared limits to what they are willing to do, the Kremlin's ability to dictate strategy will continue to erode. This would not only affect the current conflict, but also Russia's broader posture on the global stage. In the end, what we are witnessing is not just a military issue, but a systemic one. It reflects the strain placed on an authoritarian system by prolonged stress and unrealistic expectations. When loyalty is demanded without accountability from the top, even the most disciplined institutions can begin to fracture. The coming months will be critical in determining whether this historic defiance marks the beginning of a deeper transformation or simply a temporary rupture in an otherwise rigid system. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive. If you found this explanation useful and want to stay informed as this situation continues to unfold, make sure to stay connected with the channel for more detailed analysis and updates.